I spent 9 years in a cell for a murder I didn't commit, and the man who actually did it sat 2 rows behind my fiancée at every single hearing, saying nothing. That's the part people can never quite believe when I tell this story. Not the wrongful conviction itself. People have heard those stories before. It's the fact that the person who could have saved me was standing right there the whole time, close enough to see my face when the verdict came down, and chose silence instead. My name is Marcus Reed. Before any of this happened, I was an auto mechanic in a mid-sized city, engaged to a woman named Renata, and about as unremarkable as a person gets. I fixed transmissions during the day, came home smelling like motor oil, and watched game shows with my fiancée at night. We were saving for a house. Nothing special, a small place with a yard big enough for a dog we hadn't picked out yet. My best friend since we were 9 years old was a guy named Danny Wexler. We grew up 2 houses apart. He was the kind of friend you don't remember a version of your life without. Best man at the wedding we hadn't had yet. That's who Danny was to me. One night, a convenience store clerk was killed during a robbery a few blocks from my apartment. I wasn't there. I was home alone, because Renata had a late shift at the hospital that night. No alibi witness, just me in an empty apartment watching television I couldn't tell you a single detail about now, with nothing to prove where I'd been. The detective on the case, a man named Alan Voss, had a partial description from a witness, a man of similar build and height to me, wearing a dark hoodie. That description could have matched a few thousand men in that city. But my name came up because I'd had a minor altercation with the store owner 2 weeks earlier over a bounced check. It was nothing, a raised voice, an apology, a handshake. But it was enough for Voss to build a theory, and once a detective has a theory, evidence has a strange way of bending itself to fit it. I remember the interrogation room more clearly than almost anything else from that period of my life. The fluorescent light that buzzed slightly off rhythm. Voss leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world, telling me it would go easier if I just told the truth, as if the truth were something I was withholding, rather than something I was screaming into a room that had already decided not to hear it. I asked for a lawyer 3 times before one actually showed up. The trial took 4 days. My public defender was overworked, juggling a caseload that made it impossible for him to give my case the attention it needed. The eyewitness, shown a photo lineup where I was the only person who vaguely matched the build described, picked me out with a confidence the jury found convincing. I watched 12 strangers' faces while that happened and understood in real time that I was losing. Danny came to 2 of the 4 days. I remember being grateful he showed up at all, grateful in the middle of the worst week of my life that my best friend cared enough to sit in a courtroom gallery. I didn't know then what I know now. He wasn't there to support me. He was there to see whether it would work. I was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 18 years. I was 29 years old. I remember Renata's sound when the verdict was read. Not a scream, something quieter and worse, like all the air leaving a room at once. I looked for Danny's face in the gallery before they led me out. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking down at his hands. Renata never stopped believing me. She wrote to me every week for 9 years, sometimes twice. She hired investigators when she had almost no money left to hire them with, working double shifts to afford it. She moved to a smaller apartment to free up cash for the appeals process. Every visit, she'd sit across from me with the same steady expression, like she'd already decided this was temporary and refused to let the state's paperwork convince her otherwise. She once told me, through the glass, "I don't need you to prove it to me. I already know. I just need everyone else to catch up." I held on to that sentence more nights than I can count. Danny visited exactly 3 times in 9 years. Each time, he seemed smaller, somehow, more folded in on himself, like something was eating at him from the inside. His shoulders rounded a little more each visit. He stopped meeting my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. I used to think it was grief, that seeing me like that hurt him too much to come more often. I understand now it wasn't grief. It was guilt, and guilt is a much heavier thing to sit across a visitation table with than grief ever is. Year 3, Danny stopped answering Renata's calls. Year 5, he moved out of state without telling either of us directly. She found out from a mutual friend. Year 7 is when things really started to shift, though I didn't know it at the time. Renata mentioned almost as an aside during a visit, that she'd heard Danny was drinking heavily, that he'd lost his job at the warehouse he'd worked at for years, that his marriage, he'd gotten married in year 4, someone I'd never even met, had fallen apart. She said he seemed to be falling apart for no reason. I told her some people just have bad years, bad decades even. I had no idea I was the reason. I had no idea my best friend was drowning in something I couldn't see, 3 states away, because of a night I hadn't even been present for. It was year 9 when Danny finally came to see me, sober, for the first time in longer than either of us could remember. I almost didn't recognize him when they brought him into the visitation room. Thinner, older than 9 years should have made him. Eyes rimmed with something that looked like exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He sat across from me and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. I asked him what was wrong. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I sat back and waited, because that's a thing prison teaches you. Patience, even when your whole body wants to lean forward and shake the words out of someone. "It was me," he said. "The store. That night, it was supposed to be quick, just cash, and it went wrong, and I panicked, and I ran, and I never came forward, and I told myself every single day for 9 years that I was going to fix it, and every single day I didn't. I watched you get arrested and told myself it would get sorted out on its own. I watched you get convicted and told myself an appeal would fix it. I kept finding reasons to wait one more day, and the days turned into years, and I don't have an excuse that makes any of that okay. I just have the truth, finally, 9 years too late." I didn't say anything for a long time. Not because I was deciding whether to forgive him. That would come later, slowly, in pieces I'm still finding. But because 9 years of a very specific, nameless kind of grief was finally being handed an actual shape. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Because I can't keep watching you pay for something I did," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. I thought I could live with it. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting myself, and none of that ever made it feel any lighter. I haven't been able to live with it for years now. I just didn't have the courage to say it out loud until today. Danny turned himself in 3 days later. He gave a full confession, consistent with physical evidence that had never quite fit the original case. Details only the actual person there that night could have known. Details that Detective Voss's original theory had quietly buried, because it didn't fit the story he'd already decided to tell. My conviction was vacated 11 months after that, following a review that moved faster than anyone expected once an actual confession existed to anchor it. I walked out of that building into daylight I hadn't stood in without supervision in 9 years. It felt too bright, almost unbearable, the way a room feels when you've been in the dark too long. Renata was there. She hadn't aged the way I expected. Or maybe she had, and I just couldn't see it past how exactly the same her face looked to me in that moment. We didn't say anything for a long time either. We just stood there in a parking lot, holding on to each other like 2 people making sure the other one was actually real. Danny is serving his sentence now. 11 years, the term the court settled on, given his confession and cooperation. I visited him twice. I won't pretend it isn't complicated. 9 years is a long time to carry rage for someone, and it doesn't just evaporate because the truth finally arrived. Some days I understand him completely. I know what fear does to a person, how it convinces you that waiting one more day is safer than facing what you did. Other days, I can't understand him at all, and I don't try to. Both of those things are true at once, and I've stopped needing them to resolve into something simpler. What I tell people now is this: the truth doesn't always arrive when you need it. Sometimes it takes years, and it costs you nearly everything, and it only shows up once someone else's guilt finally gets too heavy to carry alone. I can't tell you to wait patiently for that, because I didn't wait patiently. I raged, I grieved, I gave up more times than I can count, and then I kept going anyway, because Renata refused to let me stop. I was just the person it happened to. But I can tell you that when the truth finally does arrive, what you do with it afterward is the only part that's actually still yours to decide. I'm 40 now. I have a small mechanic shop of my own, the kind of thing I used to talk about with Renata during those long visitation room silences, back when it was just a way of imagining a future that felt impossibly far away. We got married 2 years after my release. We have the dog now, the yard, the small, ordinary life that got stolen from us for almost a decade. I don't take a single unremarkable Tuesday for granted anymore. I don't think I ever will again. If this story meant anything to you, tell me in the comments, do you think you could forgive someone who let you take the fall for 9 years? Subscribe for more true stories like this one.